to the Earth Perfect Symposium organizer, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Marcus de la Fleur, who is brought to us today by Millersville Native Plants. So please welcome Marcus.
Thank you. Thank you very much and welcome. Now I have to share this. Usually I end up like this, and by the end of the presentation I walk out like this, and I always complain, why don't they have podiums for tall people? Now watch this. Isn't it awesome? They finally invented one for me. All right. Beautiful. Okay, I was listening in this morning like most of you were, I suppose. And the one thing that went through my mind is that utopia or utopian is really something very personal, isn't it? Like my utopia may not be necessarily your utopia. And if I look at it in garden terms, sometimes I walk by these places that have a perfectly manicured lawn with a perfectly shaped circle in it, with a perfectly shaped bush peony in it, no weed, clean soil, clean grass, clean everything. It just makes me cringe. But it's their utopia. Now, vice versa, if these people would walk by my garden, they'd possibly cringe at my utopia. So it's sort of interesting, how you can start playing with that. I really loved Naomi's introduction this morning about the utopian history and the paradigms that are out there. And I wish she would have kept going on this one because I really find it fascinating. And so things popped into my mind about other examples in paradigm. And one thing that came to mind was the Wörlitzer Gartenreich, which is back in the former East Germany, in the German state of Saxony-Anhalt, which was created by the Baron Leopold III. He was a significant player in the Enlightenment movement, and he started creating this particular landscape park back in, I just looked this up earlier, 1740. And that whole Enlightenment movement really changed the landscape and how the landscape was used in that part of Germany very significantly, and it lasts up to this day. And he basically created his own utopia with this particular landscape park, which is sort of in the English style landscape parks. And while visiting and studying the place, the one thing that really stuck to my mind was the principle of combining the beautiful with the useful. And one really interesting example was that he took the country roads, in contemporary terms we would talk about highways, and made sure they were turned into boulevards. By that I mean they had at least one row of trees planted along them. If not two, that has one row on one side and one row on the other side. He didn't take any trees. He used fruit trees. He wanted to combine the useful with the beautiful. And he was very interested in the varieties, the apple varieties that were out there and what they could be used for. There were apples for eating, there were apples for preserving, there were apples for jam, there were apples for juice, you name it. And all these varieties went in there. A lot of these have been lost over time. But if you go back there today, you still find them. This thing has stuck and was so successful after a big battle of the stubborn. You have the baron, you have the peasants. The peasants can be really stubborn. They didn't want any of that new stuff. But the baron was stubborn too. So he persisted. And his ideas, or some of his ideas, or some of the Enlightenment ideas persisted to this day. I just very recently had the privilege to visit my brother in Weimar, Germany, which is a little bit further south, a little bit further southeast. Weimar is the home of Goethe and Schiller, the poets, or I don't know if you know this Bauhaus school of Weimar. That's where it sort of evolved, the minds of Gropius, Kandinsky, etc. Sort of put their minds together there. And while walking through the landscape there, you still find those country roads that are lined with these fruit trees, mainly apple trees, sometimes pear trees. And when I talked to my brother, it's really interesting to see that they are still used. The culture really is still as such that people in the fall go out there and start collecting them and preserving them, processing them, making sure they go to use. I mean, some of it is wasted, of course, but if I think in our landscape, I almost see it all wasted because nobody wants to go in and touch it. They're a very different culture. Well, what I would like to do is talk about building a small utopia myself, or trying to build a utopian showcase. And that utopian showcase I use to demonstrate how water should be used in the landscape. There is the reality on how we do use or treat water in landscape, which gets us into deep, deep trouble, as you may know. And it's even not a utopia, it's just common sense on how we should use water in landscape, which makes ecological and sustainable sense. And I would like to do that, first by dimming off the lights a little. Let me try one more, there we go. I would like to do that by walking you through a pilot project at my former residence in Elmhurst, Illinois, just outside of Chicago. And, excuse me, what we have here bear with me for 1 second. Okay, what we have here is a small green roof. The previous images showed a couple of rain barrels. We also have a cistern on the project, a bioswale. We have a porous pavement on the project, another porous pavement technology that's gravel grass, and then the rain guards with the native plants. And I'll walk you through each of these items individually to explain what they are, what they do, why we use them, how we should use them. So let's start that part of the presentation with the green roof. This joke never gets old. I'm telling this joke for 10 years now. it's still, well, because people are still sort of freaked out by this whole idea of green roof, like having plants and dirt on your roof. People still cringe at that. This sort of puts people usually at ease. Start with a little birdhouse, and if that works out, you can walk over to the green roof bar, where you can sit down and sort of contemplate what your next steps are. But then seriously, there are the real green roofs. This is the Peggy Notebaert Museum on the lakefront in Chicago. This was a project done by Conservation Design Forum, where I worked at the time, an extensive green roof. And we have, in the past 10 years, come a long, long way from getting the looks like, where do you come from? You want to grow plants on my roof? Are you out of your mind? To, we have several 100,000 square feet of green roofs by now installed across the United States. And then utopia comes into mind, like, what if we could have green roofs everywhere? And again, it's sort of really fluent, because is it really utopia? If you look around in other parts of the world, you have developments and subdivisions where you find every square foot of roof covered by a green roof. So where does utopia start and where does it end? Now, let's get very modest here and humble and start with my 250 square foot green roof on the pilot project, which is a retrofit installation. And the one reason why we put it up on this particular roof is if you walk by the front of the house and you're taller than 3 feet, you actually can see it. It was really important to us to give visual access of the roof to the walker-bys, have it as a demonstration project. It's a no-frills green roof. It's a very simple extensive system. The total depth of the system is 4 inches, that's it. No irrigation in there. And then these things don't need to be heavy either. I mean, the green roof like this typically weighs between 25 to 30 pounds per square foot saturated. So that's sort of the number that the structure engineer uses to check if you can actually afford to have that thing on your roof without sitting underneath it and then having it in your lap. In order to understand the green roof a little bit better, let's look into the guts, and we can do so by looking at the construction, how a green roof is actually put together. So we have put a new roofing membrane on there, which is the black stuff, and then you see the white edge along the roof. That's a vertical aluminum edge. It's perforated to let the water out. And so now we can start building up the green roof behind it. And we start the process with a protection membrane. The purpose of the protection membrane is to protect the waterproofing, because the last thing we want is like anything damaging the waterproofing. Does that make sense? On the protection fabric, we put a drainage layer, which is lightweight, small aggregate, like pea gravel, but significantly lighter than that. And here the protection fabric really does its work because it keeps those pea gravel elements away from the waterproofing, because you want to make sure the waterproofing lasts for many, many, many years. The drainage layer is very important because we have to control the water level within the roof. We try to grow plants in a really extreme environment, and to do so, we sort of need to moderate the growing conditions. So controlling the hydrology with the gravel layer becomes really important. Over the gravel layer, we put a separation fabric that's held down by these soil bags here, or soil medium bags. And then we spread the soil over. The separation fabric is very important because you have the growing medium, which is a very fine medium, and underneath it you have the drainage layer, which is a coarse medium. The last thing you want is have the fine medium migrate into the coarse medium, because then the coarse medium doesn't drain anymore, does it? The separation fabric takes care of that. We start spreading out everything very carefully to make sure that the weight is distributed evenly. And again, this is where it becomes a bit rocket science. You can't just throw dirt up there. It has to be a ground medium. And this has not only to do with weight control, because this ground medium is relatively light. It also has to do with the growing conditions, which we need to moderate. So this is specifically engineered to be not too wet, not too dry, somewhere in the middle, so that you can at least have a very narrow plant palette that would survive under these conditions without irrigation. And where do you think, in this roof, where do you think you would have the highest root density? Any guess on that one? Pardon me? Highest root density. So you have the plants in there growing right now. You have all these different layers and materials in there. Where would you find the highest concentration of roots? The top? Bottom? Where on the bottom? It's really interesting. If you start folding the thing up, the highest density of roots, ironically, is in the protection fabric, which is like a 1/4-inch thick fiber mat. That's where all the roots hang out. Why? Because that's the last piece in the whole roof assembly that still will have water. That's the last thing to dry out. So that's where the roots hang out. That's a popular space. Yes. It's just so to understand, how these pens work and how water moves through the whole system. There was the green roof construction. Let's move on. There is always the other issue about the green roofs, and that is, how do they look? Just recently I saw on a professional forum discussion about failing green roofs and this and that, and I suddenly realized it's not about failing green roofs, it's about our definition on what a green roof needs to look like. Because some of the green roofs that were described as failed, they're just doing what they're supposed to do. It's just that the expectation of what the green roof looked like was very far removed from the actual reality, if you know what I mean. And then it gets a label failed. So explaining what a green roof looks like throughout the season is sort of a utopian task. So I just started taking a lot of pictures throughout the season and then put the timelapse together so you can judge for yourself and how this works. Because there's always the worry about, doesn't look good in the winter, doesn't look good in the fall, and then in the summer when it's dry, it looks really crappy, and so on and so forth. So hopefully this is going to start to answer some of those questions on the green roof looks. Now, one of the reasons why we are really so interested in the green roof, it's not just the looks, but again, it comes back to combining the useful with the beautiful. And there is the useful part to it, because green roof can really be a great help, particularly in denser urban environments, can be a great help, where's my mouse, here it is, to help with stormwater management, because green roofs provide the sponge that can absorb the runoff that falls, or the precipitation that falls onto the roof. I don't want to swamp you with numbers. I'll just give you a little bit of anecdotal evidence here on how this works out. We have two little video clips. The one is the conventional roof on the project, and the other one is the green roof on the project. You, in both cases, see the gutters. Let me start with the conventional roof. If I get it to play. There we go. All right, same rain. These two videos are taken seconds apart from each other, and on the conventional roof, you clearly can see how the water shoots off the roof, dumps into the gutter, and then flows toward the downspout, right? If I move over to the green roof, if you look really, really hard, you see raindrops falling into the gutter. But right now, there's nothing draining from the green roof yet into the gutter because the green roof still can absorb some of this rain and holds it like a sponge. Does that make sense? Okay, if you move now down from the gutter to the downspouts, this is the conventional roof, and compare that to the green roof. Okay. Oh, it's running. I thought it wasn't running. Let me start this again. So hopefully this piece of anecdotal evidence somehow demonstrates what the stormwater management capacity of a very simple green roof can be. And again, no cheating going on here. The same contributing area, same rainstorm, just seconds apart from each other. So we have a demonstration here on the usefulness of the green roofs and how they work, but we also have a demonstration here on what's happening with our conventional roofs where we have a lot of rainwater coming off. So the question is, what are we going to do with that water? Does it need to go to waste, or can we do something useful with it too, or maybe make it even beautiful? And the answer is yes, which brings me to the next topic. I have problems with my flash application here, which are the rain barrels which are on the south side of the house. So let's take a closer look at those. Excuse my technical difficulties here. There we go. At the time, this was 2004, we didn't buy rain barrels. For many reasons, we couldn't afford them. At that time, rain barrels were still hugely expensive. And the other thing when I did some research is that the plumbing that was provided on the rain barrels didn't make any sense whatsoever. And I'll come to this one a little bit later. So my friend and landlord, Ben, got these soap barrels from the car wash. We rinsed them out, and we basically started then constructing our own rain barrels, the set of 3 pairs. And I want to look at the upper one a little bit closer to talk about the rain barrel plumbing and what you have to think about, because rain barrels are sort of the epiphany of what can go wrong, because people think rain barrels are so sexy. They are so simple, so I want to put them up, and 3 weeks to 3 months later, they disappeared. Because where previously, without rain barrel, everything was working fine. Now they have the rain barrel, and suddenly things are flooding because we haven't thought things through. So I'm going to walk you through this a little bit. If I can get this thing to work. Let's see. Okay, first question is, if you have 3 rain barrels, where do you connect them to each other? There we go. You connect them to each other at the very bottom, not way halfway up the middle or on the top. You connect them at the very bottom. Why do you do that? Because you have 3 containers now, but you have 1 storage volume, because if it rains, the rain barrels fill up all at the same time because they're all connected at the bottom. Does that make sense? Very important, particularly if you get the rain barrel in one end and you need to take the water out the other end. Next thing is that you must have an overflow, a controlled overflow from the rain barrel. I have a large spigot 2/3 up. Once the water reaches there, it overflows into a little paved channel that takes the water around the house into the front rain garden. This is what a lot of people overlook, either the overflow, or if they have an overflow, where does the water go? If you don't address that, then you get flooding. Then you suddenly have water in your basement where you previously hadn't. So you have to think those things through. The next thing is, or actually a step before that is, you need to think about proportions. It makes no sense, excuse my language, to have a big-ass roof and 1 rain barrel. It rains for 15 seconds, the thing is full. It doesn't make sense to have a small tool shed and 6 rain barrels. You're going to wait all year for them to fill up. Does that make sense? So think about the proportion. Take a ½ inch rain, calculate over the surface area of your roof, and then you can figure out what storage volume you would roughly need, and then you can convert that into rain barrels. Okay, the overflow, once it stops raining, you have that water stored. You now can either use it to irrigate your vegetables. So if you have no use for it, then a day or 2 days later, you basically let it drain by opening the bottom spigot. And again, it goes around and into the front rain garden if we don't have any irrigation needs, which on this project we don't really have any because of native plants. I come to that one later. And sometimes we had some use for the vegetable garden. And then we are in freezing climates. That includes Delaware here. We are not in the southeast or not in the southwest. So what do you do with rain barrels in the winter time? There's always a big question. The answer to that is you leave the bottom spigot open, so there's no water in them at all. And then we have this flexible piece that we move over to the rigid piece. So in wintertime, all the water bypasses the rain barrels, comes out the bottom into a paved channel, flows again around the rain barrels into the front rain garden in a controlled way. Not haphazard, but in a controlled way. Does that make sense? Now I finally figured out, if you look at these rain barrels, you can't, if you want to buy them, you hardly ever can do this, where you open the bottom spigot and let them all drain out. Why? Because there is no bottom spigot. It's always somewhere up, usually a third. And then finally, it occurred to me why that is. So you can put your watering can or watering bucket underneath it. Now there's a very simple solution to that too. Just put your rain barrels on a little pedestal, and then you can have the spigot at the very bottom. You can get the water in the bucket or rain barrel. Does that make sense? So something just about thinking these things through. Okay, next subject is, we talked about the green roof. Precipitation hits the roof first, so we thought through what we're going to do in the front. We thought through the south-facing roof, which goes into the rain barrels. So we have the north-facing roof. What we are doing here is we take all that runoff and channel it into an underground cistern, where again we harvest it and we store it for later reuse. If we only would have something to use it for in this particular case. Something just gave it to my neighbors when they were ready to get water their lawn. I said, I have water in my cistern, do you want to use it? Here is the cistern. It's sort of hard to see because everything is underground, so hopefully this little photo montage sort of explains what's going on. There's a 1,200-gallon storage tank underground, the lid on the top. The beauty with the cistern is that it provides you year-round storage, or it takes advantage of the wet season in fall and winter and spring, because this thing doesn't freeze up, because it has a thermal mass around it, which is Mother Earth. You can store all the water, or most of the water, from fall, winter, and spring in there, and then have it ready for use during the hot summer months. Does that make sense? With the rain barrels, you solve at a much shorter time cycle. The cistern, you really can think seasonal. Now, in our case, we had to do quite a little bit of repair work to get the thing done. We first had to clean all the muck out because I was sitting there doing nothing for 70 years or so, put a new riser on, and then we were ready to go and happy to go. Moving on from the cistern to, oh yes, everything needs an overflow. We talked about the overflow with the rain barrels. What happens if the cistern is full? It needs an overflow too, and the overflow of the cistern goes into the adjacent biosphere, and that's the thing I want to talk about next. Let's see if we can move on. There we go. It's a large garden spigot, and yes, you do want to have a diameter that matches what comes in to what comes out, because that spigot was 2/3 up. I had what I called 1/3 bounce volume. So that allowed, if the water came in faster than it went out, it could use that extra storage volume, and it sort of largely worked out. But the preference would be, in general, the size coming in should be the overflow size going out. You're correct. Thanks for pointing that out. This is the north side of the house. This is about the property line, so we had 7 feet there. So we had to think this through a little bit, because you want to be very careful on introducing water this close to the house. This is an old house with an old basement. And don't get me wrong, I like swimming pools, but I like them on my term. So we thought this very carefully through. And let me use this diagram, so I'll walk you through that. If you take a cross-section of a typical swale, it didn't work out, because there's a property line, we didn't have that room. And the idea came, what about if we clip 2/3, and don't take me literally, but 2/3 of the swale off, we end up with this, which is good because now we are within the property line, and also the low point is the point that's farthest away from the foundation, if that makes any sense. So if I cut everything away, if it starts raining and the cistern is full and starts overflowing, the biosphere can fill up to what we call a high water level. The water can't get any higher than this, because now there would be an overflow out of the biosphere at this end. And the whole point is that I give the water residence time so it can infiltrate into the ground, because usually the ground is the bottleneck. Usually what happens is, on many instances, the water comes out of the sky faster than it actually can go into the ground. By giving it residence time, I can make up for the deficiency and make sure that actually all the water that falls out of the sky can infiltrate into the ground. It does its job. Then I have normal water level. And what usually happens in most rains is that I barely get any water in at all because there's capacity in the cistern or it didn't rain that much. So high water level we actually never saw. Water level possibly neither, but it's then hard to tell because the vegetation is hiding it. And this is what typically is happening. And so it kept us safe with the basement and the unintentional swimming pool. So it has worked fine in this case, but I would caution everybody to be very careful about introducing water this close to the house. Let me see what's next. Porous pavement. Let's look at that part. Now, before there's porous pavement, there is the subject of dealing with the old pavement, which was your typical concrete. So we took that all up, and we sort of had an unwritten zero waste policy on this whole project. So rather than throwing all that old concrete walk into the truck and bring it to the dump, the question is, what are we going to do with that? The small pieces we use in the aggregate base for the porous pavement. And then the large pieces, do you recognize where they went? We were actually able, by breaking the concrete walk up in relatively regular pieces, we were able to reuse those pieces all. Like in Chicago, we have the word or the term called urbanite, not limestone, but urbanite. So we use those as you would use limestone to create little retaining walls and curbs and stuff like that. It's one of those interesting dilemmas we have if you try to be more responsible with waste management and more innovative about reusing and recycling, but then you have like projects that are under contract. Now, how can we reconcile this innovative use with sort of the rigidity of the contracting world? I mean, this can work in a design-build environment where you rip something out in one project and think, oh, I have this other project, I can reuse it there. But if, let's say, Newark puts out something to bid, how do you want to bid this? Because where do you know that you get this stuff from? How do you know about the availability? So I would like to think that one day we can solve this challenge, but right now it's really hard to get into the innovative salvaging and reuse on contract work. Anybody work with porous pavers here? Nobody? I mean, since 10 years ago, we have the privilege that there are many more products available. We actually have a choice of products now, which was very hard 10 years ago. Whether you have pavement systems that have the extended gaps through which the water can flow, or they have the holes through which the water can infiltrate. There are vegetated porous pavement types. Be careful with those. You really need a very moderate climate, like a maritime climate, for them to work. Most of the continental US is continental climate, and that stuff tends to burn off. Or you can do what we did, is basically creating our own porous pavement system by salvaging and reusing used pavers, basically brick pavers and Holland stone pavers, and so build our own porous pavement system out of them. Because we wanted a shoestring budget, we couldn't buy any of the pavers. We were just going around and collected them from people that had some left over or were ripping the driveway out. And we said, yeah, we gladly take that, thank you. How does porous pavement work? We surely know how our regular pavement works. If the video works. There we go. Which drains very poorly in most cases. But if you look over to the porous pavement, you'll be hard-pressed to find any ponding water at all. It basically infiltrates right into the system. And to understand what's going on there, we are best off looking at the system. The key is that we have the base that's composed of crushed aggregate, which is open-graded aggregate. So you have no fines in here, and you end up with a porosity between the stone of up to 40%. And that's what's starting holding the water, and that's also what allows the rain, basically, when it falls onto the pavement, to fall right through and into it. And then it fills up the voids in here, and that's where we get the water storage. And this is very important because, again, we have the soil that is the bottleneck, and the water that may come out the sky faster than it can infiltrate into the ground. So by giving it residence time here, the porous pavement does what's supposed to do. It's slowly infiltrating it back into the ground without getting any runoff at all, unless you have a really bad rain event. Does that make sense? It's about giving the water, giving the runoff residence time in the system to let it slowly infiltrate into the ground. So it's a refreshing season if I look at this in June. There's always a question about what do you do with porous pavement when it snows? For some reason, porous pavement must be very different than any other pavement. And I get a lot of people completely hung up about how they use porous pavement in the winter. I don't know if winter is such a big deal in Delaware, but in the Midwest it always is a really big deal. So what do you do when it snows? Have you seen my presentation before? Then you have a good common sense. Indeed, you do shovel it. I don't know. I have this video in there because people don't believe me. For some reason, I have the opinion you can't clear snow of porous pavement. You can do it, fine. Okay, that gives us the next thing. And get the question, what about the ice?
It may melt faster because you have more material that's holding more.
Well, you actually go even a step beyond that. In order to have ice, you need to have standing water, right? So this is on my, at the time, was on my walk to the office, from the pilot project to the office, and it got warm overnight, you get this, next day it is freezing again, and you can ice skate to work. I call it my ice ballet. Now, if you look at the porous pavement and take the worst case scenario, you have the brick paver 4 by 8 inches, a drop of water falls on the one corner, which is the high point, so the drainage path is 9 inches, and then the water is gone. That's why you don't have ice on porous pavement. Disclaimer here, if you have a downspout, the discharge stuff onto the porous pavement, you will get ice. Because now you have such a big volume that you get ice built up. So it's not like it never will have ice, but under normal conditions, you will not have ice on porous pavement. Okay, let's move. Pardon me?
Weeds growing through the cracks.
Don't you love that? They make it green. That's where it comes to the one utopia versus the other again. You will get stuff germinating in the porous pavement. If it's used for driving, you will get very little because the traffic basically keeps it out. And then it's just a matter of whether it fits in or not. And in our case, we never really had a problem with it. And if it gets to the point where it gets tall enough, then it's easy to pull. So once a month, I pull the big stuff out. And then sometimes when it gets really hot and dry, that takes care of it then too.
Do the bricks move with freezing and thawing?
No, they don't. The reason is why is if you recorded one graphic with the crushed aggregate underneath it, that's almost like built like a road. It's almost built like a road because you want to have all the crushed aggregate to store the water. So you literally can drive a truck over that stuff. It's built that strongly with all that aggregate. You see what I'm saying? If you think about typical paths that are built in residential applications, they scoop up some soil, they put some sand down, they put the pavers down. And 2 years later, you can do surfing on that stuff but not walking. It's because there's no structure underneath it that keeps it in place. With the porous pavement, if you install porous pavement properly to store and infiltrate the water, you don't have the issues of frost heave and all that stuff because it's built so strong, it's literally like a road base. The gravel grass, that's the other porous pavement type I quickly want to talk about. That's something that I'd hardly ever see here in the United States. It's something that is readily applied in Europe. And no, this is not gravel grass. This is my introduction to it. This is the stuff that drives me nuts. It's what I call the in case we need it parking lot, like 1 or 10 times in a year fall. I mean, we all have seen that stuff. Now, how many malls can you recall or count on your fingers where these parking lots ever fill up? I mean, seriously. I can think about maybe 2. Now, what drives me nuts is that as a landscape architect, I'm required to put this stuff in the ground by code and ordinance. We are paving over our natural resources just for the in-case scenario. So I really would like to challenge that notion as much as we can. It doesn't need to be that way. There are alternatives to paving it over, and the alternative in this case would be gravel grass. This is a pilot project we installed at the minor baseball league at Kane County Cougars, also in Illinois. Made perfect sense here because you have the occasional and seasonal use. This was the overflow parking lot for the weekend games, and it only got seasonal use from spring to late summer. Does that make sense? The rest of the year it didn't. That was a theory. They ran out of money, so the other parking lot, which was meant to be asphalt, wasn't built. So my overflow parking lot became regular parking lot. Like, almost daily use. Whenever they had a game, there were cars on here. And this photograph is taken after those conditions. So it held up surprisingly well, which was really very encouraging. It works the same way as the regular porous pavement. You have your crushed aggregate with the 40% void space and the same depth, so that you actually can, when the precipitation falls on it, you can store the water in there. You give it the residents time to infiltrate back into the ground. The void space will be possibly a little bit less because we always want to mix a little bit of loam in there at a ratio of 10:1 or 10:2 to give a little bit mineral base to the drought-tolerant grasses we plant in there. And this is a 1-to-1 cross-section. This is 12 inches. And if you look at the close-up, you actually can see the grass roots readily growing in there. So what this gravel grass pavement provides is the structural capacity to take the car traffic on it, and the horticultural capacity to have those drought-tolerant grasses growing in it too. Under normal traffic conditions, that is sort of the density you get. If you have high traffic conditions, it will be blank. The nice thing is once traffic reclines, the grasses move back in, and if there is hardly any traffic conditions on there, you couldn't even tell it's gravel grass. It looks like any other turf. And here's it sort of shortly after installation, growing in and growing into place, and it ends up to be our in case we needed parking spot. If it would have been me, this would have been native vegetation, but it was rental property, and I was talking to my friend Ben, the landlord, and he said, Marcus, I don't know who's going to live here. Maybe your shop with 5 cars need the parking spots. So we turned it in case we need a parking spot, but also allow it to properly manage the rainwater. Moving on from that to, I think we have one item left. The rain gardens, yes, it's my favorite topic. Okay, this was the backyard where we had the rain garden before the installation. We were in the preparation mode there. Move on. You can see it is now installed. It is graded. You may see a slight depression in there. We put some sand mulch down. We seeded the rain garden, so we put our seeds in sand mulch, put the erosion control blanket out, and then over the next couple of years, we basically had to go patiently through the establishment phase. This is the time where you really want to on top of looking at the ecological niches, so you don't get the volunteer species in there that you don't want in there. You get through a really interesting succession of plants. It never looks the same any given year. Every year has a different environmental condition or climatic conditions, water conditions. That means something else is popping up. And once fully established, we go back to the question of what does it look like? Now, the one thing to keep in mind is that this was all established from seeds and seeds only. So the only control I had is, the species I picked to be represented in there, but I had no control on where they will grow because they germinate where the conditions are right. If you want to have a little bit more control and have a lot more money, you can buy plugs and plant them where you want them and seed in between. And if that's still not good enough, you can spend a lot more money and have 100% control by taking all the plugs or plant it all with plugs, and you can decide where they are to grow. Now, the problem is that these little buggers have the tendency to flower, and then they seed. So if you really want to have them control, you really have to put the maintenance in it to keep it under control and in the shape in which you want it. Which brings me to this other interesting topic about using native plants.
I got a quick question. That looked like it was above the grade of your walkway. Is that intentional? Wouldn't you normally want your rain garden to be below the grade of your walkway?
if there may have been like a 1 or 2 inch rise from the walkway up and then down, because I need a level ridge around the rain garden. But no, that would have been the max. Yeah. So there's 100 ways of designing a rain garden. You can have it naturalistic, like I had it on the pilot project. You can have it much more controlled and designed, like in the next couple of pictures. The one thing I would like to address is the bias against native plants. There's this notion that you can't have native plants in a stylized or designed garden. Sort of native always is equated with the natural and untamed look. What I would like to advocate is that a stylized look is not really a function of if you have native plants or you use non-native plants, but it is actually a function of whether or how much investment you put into the field preparation, how much investments you put into the plant material, that is number, sizes, and density, and most importantly, the maintenance investment. That's really what determines the look of your design or your garden, not so much if the plants are native or non-native. You take any stylized planting, whether it's native, non-native, or a combination of the two, it won't remain stylized for very long unless it is subject to the proper maintenance input. Does that make sense? If you walk away from it, ecological dynamics will take over, which can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. It depends on your attitude and your vision. But we can't get around the ecological dynamics. If you want to get around the ecological dynamics, we need to put the system on 24/7 life support. Talking shop, maintenance. I'm a very busy man. I don't have much time for maintenance at all. So what's the maintenance for the rain garden native vegetation on this project? Not much. The biggest maintenance operation I have is once in the springtime, where I need to cut everything down to about knee height, and then get my friends and neighbors over, get my permits into the Department of Natural Management, and then get the permits over to the local fire department, and then we have 5 minutes of fun. Well, actually not even that much. 100 seconds, 2 minutes of fun. And that's my maintenance operation of the year. Okay, if you all put $1 in here, I play it again. Can I go back? Oh, there we are. So the interesting piece of this is how fast, people are always freaked out by burning a prairie. And by the way, if I say prairie, I have been told that you have to think meadow. I think what we call prairie in the Midwest, you call meadow over here. So if I say prairie, please think meadow. So a lot of people are freaked out by this one, not understanding how this fire control really works. The stuff moves through so fast that if you look very carefully at the fence edge and at the fence itself, there's snow at the bottom. And then if you look how the fire moves, there is steam coming out of the fence because we soak the fence down. There's not a burn spot on the fence at all. It moves so fast, or what happens, the steam moves out. And look at the snow. So it gives you an idea on how fast it moves through. So there's really now damage done to other than what you want to accomplish, and that's burn the old vegetation down. Burning is sort of really critical because we are talking about an ecosystem from which these plants come. That's a paraphytic ecosystem. These are used to a burn regime, burn management. And if you look at some of the remnant prairies and look at their burn cycles, they always look their best after the burn in the spring. They're the most vigorous, have the most flowers at the time. The ones that don't have burned are sort of suffocated by their own biomass from the previous years. So if I don't burn, I'm not getting these results. You can mow if you absolutely cannot burn, but you're not getting quite the same results. So that's the advantage of having the opportunity to burn those native plants, those native meadow plants. I want to go back to the water management component of this because, again, we are trying to combine the beautiful with the useful here. So let's talk about the useful again. Usually nothing gets in the garden that can't perform something. The rain garden is supposed to manage the water. Once it rains, the water gets down the roof into the rain barrels. Rain barrels are full. It overflows into the rain garden. And if it keeps raining, it's supposed to actually fill up the rain garden. The rain garden gets filled up again to what we call the high water level. It can't get any higher than this. because now there is an overflow here towards the gravel grass. So that answers your question about, is it a bit higher? It was maybe a notch higher, just to make sure that the edge around the rain garden is level, with one exception, and that's right here where I have a dip. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, the idea is that I give the water residence time, because the bottleneck is my soil. I let the water then slowly infiltrate into the ground, doing a job, and then, at the end there should be nothing left. Now, the interesting thing is that, how does this really work? I mean, this is what the model told me. The engineering model that we produced for this one to size everything told me that the high water level is something I get every other year. The normal water level is something I should get several times a year, and in this scenario, I possibly get with every other rain, if that makes any sense. So I wanted to know, and I was just at the time working a couple of blocks away from the house. So whenever I saw the storms coming through, I looked up on the weather radar, and whenever I saw the red and yellows popping up, got on my bike, quickly rode the few blocks home, and tried to figure out where is the water in my rain garden. Let me see if I can get this to work. So I can announce that I never got ever this. I never got the, there we go. I never got the high water level. I never got the normal water level, and I never got this either. So the furthest I was able to trace the water was to about there, and then it was gone. Now, do you have any idea how frustrating it is to have a rain garden and have no water in it? You have nothing to show. So that
What model did you follow? Because there doesn't seem to be too many engineering models out there to follow for rain gardens, if any.
And that's one of the biggest challenges we have. And I come back to that in a minute. So if I don't answer the question later on, bring it back up. But again, that's a challenge, the model versus reality. Hi, Matt. Just talked about skipping work. You missed it. Let me find my mouse again. There we go. So there was one exception. September 30, 2008, where we got close to a 100-year rainstorm. We were just a few tenths of an inch away from that. That day, ironically, I was presenting just down the road in the suburb of Lombard. And I couldn't wait to get out of the presentation because I had the sense something is going to happen here. When we were driving home, we were more swimming than driving home because everything was flooded. And so that's when you're working with the geek. I came home and my jaw dropped, like I have nothing to show again. And then I stepped into the rain garden and suddenly it was squish, squish. So I actually had water, and there are 4 inches of water in my rain garden for the first time ever. So it seemed to work, but then it was a 100-year storm. I think the reason why I had any water in there at all is possibly my neighbor. I mean, this is just one downspout. There are 3 more that all point towards the rain garden. So thanks to my neighbor, I finally got water into my rain garden. Now, before this happened, I had to have something to show on presentations like this. So I don't know when it was, but one early spring day before this big storm, I basically pumped the entire cistern. I pumped the entire system volume into the rain garden so that I have something to show. So it's in there, and then I sat back and waited for things to happen, and they happen. The rain garden is doing what's supposed to do. It infiltrates those 4 inches. I had 4 inches of water that I could put in the rain. So it wasn't even full. So how long do you think it took those 4 inches to infiltrate? Any guess? Clay? Midwestern glacial till?
2 hours.
Man, here's a spoiler. Excuse me. It is indeed 2 hours. So if you do your math right now, you're talking about 2 inches of our infiltration on clay soils. If I tell that my engineering colleagues, they think I'm going crazy. For them, clay means nothing. I mean, nothing in terms of infiltration. You can't infiltrate into clay. So the interesting thing is you have clay, and then you go to your county soil surveys, and you have clay, and you have everything in between. So you have your clays that put water away like there's no tomorrow, and then you have your other clays that you can use to literally build a swimming pool. So when you hear clay, don't automatically assume you can't do anything. Is anything magic about my soils? No. I have the typical glacial till with a dark topsoil layer, and then the clay underneath it. So I wanted to know what else is going on, so we did some infiltration testing there, and the results were really interesting. Are they showing up there? Yeah. So a third of an inch in the back where the gravel grass is, in the rain garden, the 2 inches that I indicated earlier on, the porous pavement, a little bit more than 2 inches. On the side of the house, there was 1 inch. In the front, there was 1 inch, a little bit more than that. On the biosphere on the other side, again, we are like at 2 inches and something. Now, if you start thinking about this one, it suddenly starts making sense, because the low infiltration rates are always where there was soil disturbance. The porch at the house, for instance, was added on later on. We found some construction debris while we were building the rain garden in the front. So this is where we have low infiltration rates. The very back where the gravel grass is possibly always a truck pulled in and out to unload material and stuff. So that's why you possibly have a really low infiltration rate there. And then the other areas that were non-disturbed have the high infiltration rates. So it gets us actually back to that there is a magic, if you so will. And that magic is that my soils really have been never exposed to something like this. Or that, if I get it to work. Now, it takes a couple of hours to wreck the soil. It will take years upon years upon years to restore it to its previous capacity, if that is even possible. So the one thing to think about in terms of sustainability is, how do we treat your soils? If you want to do sustainable stormwater management, anything, you really have to be very careful on what's going on in your soils, how you treat your soils, how you protect your soils. There is another aspect to this and the soils, which has to do with the native vegetation again. Nope. Let's go one back. There we go. So if I do a cutout, the trick or the beauty with the native vegetation is that you have the above ground biomass and you have the below ground biomass. The below ground biomass is 2/3 compared to what the above ground biomass is, so science tells us. So what's happening each year, you get this massive root structure into the ground, which is really produced by the grasses and sedges only. The forbs contribute relatively little. And it's almost like deep mulching, because 1/3 of this below ground biomass dies off every year. It's almost like you take a needle, stick in the ground, and then sort of trickle compost in there. So what happens here is you have clay soils that are tightly packed together, and now over the decades, the roots come in and start pushing those clay particles apart and provide these avenues for the stormwater or for the water generally to infiltrate into the ground. So that is what creates a sponge at the end. And I'm not making this one up. There had been science early in the century by Weaver in the 30s in Nebraska. He actually in a very meticulous way, started to excavate some of these grasses and sedges and document their actual root mass and root depth. So if you look at science, it's actually based on some really interesting research, which gets me to the pre-settlement or prehistoric hydrology, which was really powered by the prairie landscape, or if you so will, by the grasses and sedges, because what happened in the prehistoric landscape is that when water fell onto the ground, when it rained, the water went into the ground. There was hardly any surface runoff that was happening. It was mostly infiltration into the ground, because you had this big old sponge, which are called the black gold, which were the prairie soils. The water moves through the geology at different time scales, from days to weeks to decades. So it goes into the ground in the uplands, and it comes out of the ground in the lowlands, which are the wetlands, the rivers, the lakes, you name it. Because you have this infinite reservoir in the geology, in the lowlands, you basically get a flow coming out of the ground that's constant, clean, and it's constant year-round, and it also comes out at a constant water temperature. And there are a couple of places, or there's one place in the larger Chicago area that I know where this still works, which is Bluff Spring Fence in Elgin, Illinois. These are the pieces of upland, lowlands, where the water actually comes out of the ground. These are the outwash area. You look at one a little bit closer, the geology, the water moves through the geology, surfaces in the fen, and from there the little stream starts. And this image was taken 2002 in May, where we had a very dry spring. In the previous month we had like 1 inch of precipitation and no precipitation 6 days prior. And then put this one aside for a moment and look a year earlier where we had a very wet spring with almost 6 inches a month prior and a little bit over 1 inch a few days beforehand. But if you look at what's happening with the water, you can't really tell the difference at all. I mean, the one difference is 1 year it got burned, the other one year didn't get burned, but water-wise, so if you move a little bit down, dry here, wet here. So that's the evidence of this infinite reservoir, which is geology, that starts feeding stuff in no matter how dry or how wet, because it sort of can balance things out. Very dry. Oops. What happened here to clean and constant flow year-round? Now, if you started looking at this a little closer, can you see the discoloration between the one side and the other side? Right there. So what we have on one side is, in the background, you have a typical suburban stream, which is Willow Creek, I believe. With the typical suburban stormwater management, the stream gets overwhelmed, so all that stuff starts pushing into the Bluff Spring Fen watershed. On the other side, you have the clean water coming from the fens, pushing up against this wall of water. It's like a dam of dirty water. So on one side, you have constant clean flow year-round. It still functions. On the other side, you have anything but constant or clean. Does it make sense? So on one side, we have that functioning hydrology largely powered by the root system of the native sedges and bunch grasses. And on the other side, we have a system powered by another grass, Kentucky bluegrass, which is not native. What we have to think about here is that the above ground biomass is proportionally to the below ground biomass, so that's all what you get. And all of that stuff is really not contributing anything to the infiltration capacity or to the health of our soils. And it's not just Kentucky bluegrass. I mean, I single this one out here, but it's how we treat and develop the land. And the interesting thing is, this thing is hard to keep alive. If you think about it, that little bit of above ground biomass with that little bit of below ground biomass, and we have a whole industry built around just that deficiency. So if you think about it, it's really crazy. Anyhow, we found that stuff all the way around us. And what happened here is we turned that historic hydrology on its head, where previously we infiltrate in the upland, now we discharge. And where previously water was discharged in the lowlands, we now expect it to infiltrate. So 180-degree reversal. And with that, it's sort of hard to expect any good results when it comes to stormwater management or flooding treatment. And that stuff, as I said, is going on everywhere around us, certainly all the way around where the pilot project was. So I want to go from the big picture back to the pilot project itself and look at some metrics. How are we doing on time? You're fine, good. So if I look at the project prior to any improvements, I looked at the 2-month reoccurring rain. That's 1.38 inches in 24 hours. Started adding all the volumes up from that particular rainfall and ended up with a total of 980 gallons of runoff that the property produced. Numbers are interesting, but what does it mean? Oops. Let me go one back. There we go. So 980 gallon equals, 18 rain barrels. So that much runoff was produced by a relatively normal rain that you expect to happen 6 times in a year. Now this is pretty significant in a certain way. And do you know how? Let's move those to the side. So under any given normal rain, that's the runoff that property produced before any improvements. Think about it. I'm not the only kid on the block, or the neighborhood, or town. So this was sort of the default landscape. Everybody else produced that same thing. And so Naomi was asking an interesting question at the sort of the dark conclusion of her speech this morning, like what can we as humble individuals do about this big problem? Think about that, the problem you actually produce on your property, and maybe start thinking that way. I wanted to know where all that water goes, so I did some research. I'm in the Salt Creek watershed, and I don't know who is in marketing here, but I think the opportunities, Salt Creek. How about Salty Sewer or Crappy Creek? If you look at these pictures, it doesn't really deserve the Salt Creek name. Because of everybody dumping their water into the creek, that's what you get. native plants are not used or don't tolerate those rapid fluctuating conditions. So they basically pack up and leave. Or what you are left with is erosion, and those species you don't really want to have in there. Because we interrupted the base flow where the water feeds into the streams, if it doesn't rain, you have extremely low water levels. The moment it does rain, the thing is right up full to the bank because everybody dumps their stuff right in there. And so you get this rapid up and down with each rain cycle. Let's look at the property after the improvements. Did the same calculations. This time I took all the improvements in storage volume into account. So we end up with a total of 97 gallons compared to the 980 gallons. And if you put this visually again, there we go. So I previously had my 18 rain barrels. Now I'm actually down to 2 rain barrels, 97 gallons. That's a 10-fold reduction just by doing these improvements on the property. It's a 10-fold reduction in runoff volume. I'm not talking about rain, I'm talking about the actual amount of water leaving the property. Throw some other numbers at you. In engineering terms, I took this really small storm, the 2-month recurring storm, which should happen 6 times a year, so I don't blow anybody's mind. But in engineering terms, we typically talk about the 2, 10, or 100-year event. But even on those events, I can retain 94%, 87%, or 70% of the runoff on the property. So really good results. Tells me the engineering model. So that was encouraging. But then, you get to this, and you have to ask yourself the question on, what about this discrepancy? Because I was close to the 100-year, very, very close to the 100-year event that day, and that thing wasn't even full. It should have overflown big time at the time. So I think it's sort of encouraging in a sense, except that I don't really have any hard numbers I can put towards it to prove it, and that's the deficiency in those stormwater models, which are really meant for big stuff, like subdivision or towns or the like. Okay, quick quiz question for you. I have 2 storms here. I want you to take a look at them, and then you tell me which one of those 2 storms concerns you the most, whether it's option number 1 or option number 2. So option number 1. Option number 2. Which one of the 2 concerns you more? Option number 1, raise your hands. Option number 2, raise your hands. Okay, I'm in the option number 2 league, and I'll tell you why. Okay, the large rain events we get, they are usually addressed with the good old-fashioned civil engineering approaches and flood management approaches. So usually we do a relatively good job there, and in terms of inundating the ecosystem once in a while with all the runoff, like in terms of years, doesn't necessarily harm the ecosystem that much. It gets a problem if it becomes frequently like every other week. So I would put the large storm under, we dealt with that. I can't say that same thing for, if I get this thing to work, I can't say the same thing for the small storms, because right now, all the water runoff from the small storms also ends up in the ecosystem. In my case, Salt Creek. Every time it rains, whoosh, the water goes all the way up, and it goes all the way down. With that comes all the pollution, the thermal load, the first flush runoff, and that really is contributing to the ecosystem damage and loss of biodiversity we have in our natural landscape and in our streams and wetlands. So that's why I'm really concerned about the small storms. We need to stop the small storms from ever reaching those ecosystems. We have to infiltrate those on our properties. And if every second year something ends up in the ecosystem, then the ecosystem probably can manage that one pretty reasonable. But it's like every other rain, it doesn't take it. It can't take it. Back to Utopia. I would love to have clean water like this accessible to us, and I think we all should expect to have clean water like this accessible to us in our landscape. Is it utopian? I don't think so, because if you go around the world, you find examples where you have this. This is in downtown Zurich. It's the River Limmat, which flows through downtown Zurich, and if I'm not totally mistaken, that is drinking water quality, that river. So our Swiss counterparts have something figured out there that we really have to work on very hard. Same river, it's a public swimming pool on the River Limmat. It's so clean they actually have a swimming pool on the river. Do you know these advertisements for those endless pools where you can swim out? You know, same thing, but gravity does the work. You don't need any pumps. So seeing that in sort of a million city downtown, it really hit home. So the question is, how can we get there? And I think it sort of has to start with the mindset. We need to change our mindset from a conveyance-based approach when it comes to water in the landscape. That means take it from A and put it to B and let B deal with it, who puts it to C. And the poor guy at the end of the line, which is possibly New Orleans, they get all the crap. Change from that to an infiltration-based approach where I say that water's on my property and it's mine, and I'm going to do something with it that's responsible and reasonable and ecologically sound. And on this particular project, we use infiltration technology such as the green roof, the porous pavement, the gravel gas ranger, and the biosphere that really allows us to go from this runoff volume, that is, from the big runoff volume down to a small runoff volume. And that step would give us a chance, would give us a leg up on actually getting to clean water in our environment. There we go. To move from something like salty sewer, crappy creek, to a place where we can actually steward the biodiversity in our environment and claim amenities, water back in our amenity space and put it back to use for ours and for the biodiversity and the ecology. There was a lot of stuff in here, the various tools. Something may have been too quick or too hard to follow. Don't worry about it, it's all documented. The whole pilot project I put together on the website. So if you want to look more stuff up on those individual topics, feel free to visit it. And with that, I say thank you very much. And are there any questions? Netting. You always need to have a screen, yeah. I don't know if you saw those PBS specials about yellow fever in the south and southeast and how they were dealing with it. And they basically put also netting over the cisterns and drain barrels, what they used at the time. And that sort of, you have to keep the mosquitoes out, is the bottom line. So there's always a filter in there that prevents the little buggers. They may get in, but they can't get out. So if they hatch, they're trapped.
It's almost like they changed that. You would have a curve.
No, you don't. If you look at the conventional pavers that are sold in the home improvement stores, they're not porous pavers, usually. You put them together really tight. There's still like, a 1/16th of an inch gap in there. So you would say, well, water is going through that one. But no, it's not after 3 years anymore, because the same thing happens as with the stone dust. It starts clogging up. So after 3 years, that pavement is impervious. I guarantee you. So you really need to switch over to a porous pavement system where you get gaps large enough, where you can fill the gaps with stone chips. And the bedding base is stone chips, which is the 40% I was talking about earlier in porosity. And that stuff doesn't clog up, and the water just falls right through it. I mean, if you install these systems, we had one installation installed, and the fire department came by with the fire hose to demonstrate how the water goes away. And they basically pointed the fire hose onto the porous pavement. Gone. Absolutely. If you do what we did, which basically take ordinary pavement blocks that were not meant to be pervious and just turn them into pervious by providing the space in between, yes. And then it's critical that you use the right material in between and under. And stone dust or sand is a no-no, so you are back to the coarser material like the 1/4 inch or 3/8 inch stone chips. That's the smallest that should be in there, and from there you go up. The farther you go down, the bigger you get.
Has the product Haydite ever come
Come up for what? Come up for what?
Has it ever come up to be used in that sort of application?
In green roof applications. Because that's where you want the lightweight. Yeah.
Is there filtered fabric behaviors in the aggregate?
No. I say no. Talk to another engineer and you make it a definite yes. I don't like the filter fabrics in there because filter fabrics can clog up. And then you're screwed. Because to remove the clogged filter fabric, you have to disassemble everything. If you engineer your porous pavement base the right way, you can follow the principles of the filter rule, which means the small to bigger is sized in a way that the smaller doesn't migrate into the bigger and doesn't migrate further down, so it stays all in place. That I prefer much over using filter fabrics because they always have the potential to clog up. You may specify the one that doesn't clog up, but then you get the substitute put in and you learn about it too late and then you're screwed again. So I'd rather have it taken out completely and do it a different way. Also technical questions. Anything philosophical here? Go ahead.
With the gravel grass, how do you keep its height without, if you mow it, I would think you'd have projectiles. Do you not mow?
But first of all, I think I did mow that stuff twice a year maybe, and that was only when the stuff was flowering, just get the flowering stragglers off. But other than that, because the grasses are in such stressed conditions, they don't really get big to begin with. And now, I mean, the whole thing is packed down, so you don't get any, unless you set your lawnmower to golf course level, where you want to have your grass an eighth of an inch long. If you keep it like half an inch to an inch above, then you don't have that issue.
With your green roof, it had that slope. How did you address the issue of the soil moving down before your planting actually got?
Oh, at night I'm standing there holding it. That green roof is just at the cutoff. That is just at a level where you don't need to worry about it sliding off if you have the vertical edge on the edge. Once you get steeper than that, you're supposed to put additional baffling in there that prevents it from sliding down.
So what angle is that?
That particular I don't know, but I think the cutoff is like 14 degrees. 14. So I think if you go above 14 degrees, you're supposed to have additional reinforcement in there. But again, I would also always look, this is sort of the rule of thumb, but then I would always test it against each individual project. Because if I would have 50 feet of green roof behind that, then even with the 14, I would start getting nervous. Because once that starts moving, that's a lot of weight behind it, if you know what I mean. And there's a lot of water sitting in there moving out, so it's always a project-by-project decision too. Something philosophical? Any other questions? Yes.
What kind of grass did you use on the gravel grass?
On the
What's the species that you're using in the gravel grass?
festuges, Sidot's gamma, blue gamma, and buffalo grass. And the Sidot's gamma and the blue gamma and the buffalo grass were really the working horses. There was an area that was slightly more shaded right next to the fence. That's where the festues thrived in the shade. But in the full sun, it is, interesting enough, it was a native plain species that they were holding in there. Matt?
Marcus, could you talk a little bit about the community perception of
Thank you.
and the aesthetics?
Thank you.
You got this wild thing going on.
I didn't pay him, by the way. Thank you, Matt. Yes, when we started off the project, because I was renting and my friend Ben was a landlord and his wife Beth, we had this big discussion about we're going to start this, how are we going to deal with the neighbors? And I can't really remember the conclusion of that discussion, but the project went ahead anyways, and the neighbors didn't come, ever. They did come when I was like, basically once it was sort of established like this, and I did work in the front yard, I couldn't get any work done. Because every person walking by wanted to talk to me. people driving by got out their cars and said, finally, I'm driving you always by, I finally see you have this question. So that negative feedback loop that I was expecting, because this is so out of the usual and so wild and stuff, that didn't happen. And I was baffled for the longest time ever about it. And then through further discussions in forums like this and so on and so forth, it finally occurred to me that I may have a theory on why. And it has to do with that if you drive by the project and you walk by the project, it appears as not that somebody lives here who lets everything go to see what's happening, but somebody lives here and things are very intentional. And I think the intentional comes in not through the vegetation. The vegetation is anything but, or looks anything but intentional. I think the intentional comes in through the carefully crafted hardscape. So if you walk by, you see the very carefully placed porous pavers, the very careful edges of the little puzzling and details with the limestone, the reuse of the urbanite, and so on and so forth. And that sort of provided a contrast, almost a juxtaposition between the natural and threatening. But then you take the natural and threatening and put it in a very crafted frame, which is the hardscape. So that's a theory on why we believe we never got that negative feedback loop started, because we were able to keep things in balance that way, by sort of providing the crafted with the contrasting the threatening natural with the crafted. So that's sort of the theory behind that. We learned later on that our neighbors across the street became very good friends, and years later, after we moved out, they told us the story that the local alderman paid them a visit, and they had a little chit-chat, and then he said, what about the guys across the street? So he was curious about what we were up to, and my neighbors at the time were gracious enough to say, oh, don't worry about them. So that was the only time where the village sort of popped their head up and then put it back down. And subsequently, we were on the Elmhurst Garden Walk. We had 900 people coming through the property. We were on 2 or 3 of their local Green Fest. They have a Green Festival once in August or so. That was after the Garden Walk. So since then, has always become a very popular destination and showcase. Not anymore. We moved into the city of Chicago. So now, I call it now, it's phase number 2. Phase number 1 was when I was there. Phase number 2 is now, will the thing survive? And that is, under the guidance of my friend and landlord, Ben. And it was really hard to really step away from the project. But I didn't want to spoil the experiment, so I really did step away from the project to see, does it fall apart? Or does it survive? And if so, how does it survive? So that's still ongoing, but in 2009, after 5 years now, it's still there. It's still doing good. It's not looking as good as it should because he misses to burn. He always misses the application for the burn permit. So he basically has to cut things down, which makes things not look as good as they could be. But the stuff is still predominantly natives. It has not been invaded with any undesirable cold season plants. So from a vegetation standpoint, it's doing surprisingly well. And the hardscape is the hardscape. It's still there and doing a job. Yeah, starting a new project. That would be another talk on another day. That is, yeah. I'm a landscape architect, and we work on projects also often in collaboration with architects. And some of our colleagues, architect colleagues, love to play landscape architect, which can be sometimes a little bit annoying. But then it occurred to me, I can do that same thing. So with the new project, I decided to play architect. So I moved my profession a little bit over, and we bought a 100-year-old house in Chicago, a masonry 3-flat, and we are attempting to turn it into a net zero energy building, see if that's possible.
I've been looking at that online.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. That's on his website. Check it out.
Yeah, it's a completely different subject, all about green building, and the garden component hopefully will start creeping in 2014. So far I haven't gotten to that yet. Any other questions? Yeah.
This is a somewhat darker topic, and I'm sorry if this is going to be the end of it, but if you are essentially the sink in your neighborhood, what kind of concerns are there
I think there's always a concern, but I like to think about it very differently rather than being concerned with that. So my focus is, what can I do on this project or now our new project to set an example or demonstrate what you can do differently. And it goes back to Matt's question about how did the neighbors react. So we were hoping that we could take sort of the angst about some of these things away by putting them in front of people in an unthreatening way. And for 3 or 4 years, nothing happened at all. And then suddenly people started asking about the rain barrels and asking about the porous pavers. So they were all on a wait and see. And then after 3 years, figuring out that, okay, this is not gonna be a disaster, and actually it's working. Oh, look, it's useful too, and beautiful, if you want to call it beautiful. Then they started sort of buying in. So by the time I left, I think at least 3 of our neighbors on the street had gotten rain barrels and asked me about advice on how to put them up and all that stuff. The neighbor across the street put a stretching of permeable pavement, and so on and so forth. So I'm more thinking about if I can set an example of what he can do and how it works and how it's good, useful, and makes economic sense, then maybe it starts catching on. So that's what happened here, and that's sort of more the focus that I have, rather than my neighbor does that, and do I have to deal with the pesticides? You see what I'm saying?
But is there any sort of short-term threat to one to consider, well, if you're hoping for the buy-in around you? I mean, if my neighbor up my hill is constantly using chemicals that are then running off and infiltrating into my property, is there any sort of thing I should be looking for, paying attention to protect my own?
Okay, now we're talking sort of.
This is a more technical question, less philosophical.
Okay, it's about, it comes down to design. Forget this pilot project for a minute. The clients that come to me usually because they have water problems. Those water problems are hardly originating on their property only. It's usually originating either at the neighbors or at the neighbors and their property. So that threat on the project I'm working on is it's the constant present. It's always there. So then it comes down to design. How do you design for it? And often enough, we make accommodations for it. That I do my calculations not just based on my client's property, but I look at the larger watershed, try to figure out what's coming from the neighbor, and then maybe try to talk to the neighbor to ask them to sort of point things in a different direction, then see what's left over, and then I need to have to accommodate that on my client's property. So yeah, but usually it's always, when I get caught, it's a water problem. It usually originates somewhere down the road. Does that answer your question? Okay. Thank you so much, everybody. Hope you enjoyed it.